Good evening, everybody. I'm Nick Angarone, New Jersey's Chief Resilience Officer and Vice Chair of the Interagency Council on Climate Resilience. This evening, Natalie Augusto-Filione and I will be sharing the Interagency Council's Resilience Action Plan initiative with you. This is the second webinar that we've held on this topic. The first webinar provided a detailed overview on why we're doing this, what these action plans are intended to achieve, and how we plan to get there. If you missed it, that recording is posted on our website, which my staff will share in the chat. In the first webinar, we touched a bit on the first resilience action plan that we'll be developing, which is focused on extreme heat. Our goal this evening is to get your feedback on the types of actions you want to see the state taking to address extreme heat. Go ahead, slide. Briefly, before we start on that, I will reiterate a few key background items from the first webinar. Governor Murphy's Executive Order 89, signed in October 2019, established New Jersey's Chief Resilience Officer and Interagency Council on Climate Resilience. It also directed us to develop a climate change resilience strategy. That strategy was developed over the course of 2 years and released in October of 2021. One of the most important things the strategy did was define resilience for New Jersey, and that is shown on your screen. That definition is really a melding of resilience and adaptation and indicates that we're not just bouncing back, but that we're bouncing forward. Go ahead. There are 6 priority areas that make up the strategy displayed here. Across all priority areas, there are 127 recommendations for the state as a whole. I hope that you can see that these priority areas recognize a broad definition of resilience and types of actions necessary. The strategy is a policy framework that includes forward-looking state policies that address some of our vulnerabilities to climate impacts and help us strengthen resilience in the state. Importantly, the resilience strategy is meant to provide recommendations for how New Jersey state agencies can make changes to enhance resilience. It was not intended to be prescriptive as to how specific programs should change, what they should say, who should take the lead, and when they should take action. But in order to reach our resilience goals, we need to move those recommendations closer to implementation. How we're going to do that is through development of resilience action plans, which will provide a basis for state action on climate resilience moving forward. Slide. Our intent as a council is to release a series of resilience action plans over the next few years that lay out implementable yet aspirational actions that agencies are taking, will take, and should take to advance New Jersey's climate resilience. We're primarily concerned with addressing how the state's policies, programs, and decision-making can address climate impacts consistent with the resilience strategy. Each action plan will focus on a specific climate threat or impact. This is a key area that we'd like your feedback on, and one of the questions in the stakeholder feedback form. What climate threats or topics do you see as critical for the Interagency Council to prioritize? One of my colleagues will drop the link for our stakeholder feedback form in the chat. Our first action plan is focused on extreme heat. We chose this as our first topic for 2 primary reasons. 1, the statewide strategy is limited in its discussion on extreme heat. And 2, extreme heat is one of the deadliest climate impacts that we're already facing. We covered this in more detail in last month's webinar, which you can access on the Resilience Action Plan's webpage. We understand that we need to ensure we are acting urgently to mitigate the effects of increasing heat. Before turning over the virtual microphone to my colleague Natalie, I'll note that we've offered a truncated version of the background context setting slides tonight. If anyone has any questions at this time, please drop them into the chat and/or use the raise hand feature. We'll spend much of this call together discussing some of your ideas for solutions around extreme heat, and I will now turn over the mic to Natalie.
Hi, Nick, thanks for that. We've gotten 2 separate comments in the chat at this point that some folks are having trouble with the presentation. Just doing a little bit of troubleshooting here before we keep going. Ashley, do you think if we stopped sharing screen and restarted that maybe it would solve it?
How does that look?
Let's see, so Russ, Marie, Sharon, the folks that have named that it's an issue. I'm getting some thumbs up. Awesome. Good. Okay, so let us barrel ahead. Before doing that, just again, a recognition to Nick's point that this is a truncated version. The recording for the first webinar is online, but we recognize that some folks may not have seen that. So if there are any, key questions around context setting that folks would like to elevate at this point, let's take a little pause there to see if there's any information people need or want. All right, next slide, please. So as Nick said, extreme heat is one of the deadliest impacts we're already facing in New Jersey. And as you can see here, New Jersey's warming is in fact actually outpacing that of our fellow states. Even with compared to global averages, in the 125 years that we have been collecting temperature observations in the state of New Jersey, we have found a trend towards warming, certainly in the last few years, in particular in the last couple decades. And so whereas global temperatures have increased by 1.5 to 2 degrees Fahrenheit in the last 125 years, temperatures in New Jersey have increased by 3.5 degrees Fahrenheit over the same time period. Next slide, please. So over the last few months, we've been looking at best practices and emerging approaches that are coming from other parts of the United States. And much of the content that you'll see as we move through into a more sort of dynamic and interactive portion of our presentation are captured from that study of what's going on in other parts of the country. So we've gleaned a good amount of desktop research ideas. This was completed by the contractor support team for this initiative, Michael Baker International. And on this slide, you see a couple examples of state plans from New York and California, as well as other state level resources that we've been looking at. So as we've been doing that, next slide, please, we've been able to identify some consistency in how our sister states are and have been preparing for, and importantly, building resilience to extreme heat impacts. During tonight's discussion session, we're going to be diving into each of the categories that you see on the screen in more depth. So actions related to vulnerable populations, to the built environment, and to natural systems. And we are asking you tonight to provide some input on possible interventions New Jersey could or should advance to help sensitive groups, infrastructure systems, and ecosystems mitigate the negative effects of both the slow but steady warming trends, as well as excessive heat events we've been experiencing in our state. And so what's going to happen as we move into this interactive portion is we'll spend 8 to 10 minutes, maybe even more than that, if as time allows, discussing each of these categories of actions or interventions. And we're going to ask you all to use the chat function primarily to share your ideas. So you don't need to repeat something that has been said in the chat. If you are comfortable doing so, you can just click the little thumbs up button in the chat messages. And on the back end, we are collecting and organizing the feedback that we're hearing in today's call to post it online, sharing this sort of brainstorming exercise after this meeting. And so I recognize that if I were not presenting at this time of day, I would probably be cooking dinner for my family or possibly in the car driving home. So we also want to create a space to let people unmute themselves, but because of speed and in order to be able to get as many comments as possible, chat does offer some sort of streamlined options. So we're prioritizing and asking you to use the chat to share ideas, and then we will sort of open a space for anyone who wants to mute themselves and share more content. And if you're not able to use the chat function, just know that we will be reserving time before moving on to another subject or category to invite folks to offer that feedback in a verbal way. So one thing that I want to name here to just repeat, since we've had people join since Shamay's introductory welcome remarks, is that right now we are sharing information on our website, and we are inviting people to join the Office of Climate Resilience distribution list. For anyone who would rather not join another newsletter distribution list, we've created an attendance option where you can identify that you would rather just get that email directly from us. So that is at the top of the messages that have come in this chat so far. If anybody wants to, please share that message that folks have that attendance link. Next slide, please. So we've shared a little bit about the categories of actions that you might see come out of a resilience action plan, or at least a way of organizing the kinds of actions. And ultimately, New Jersey's statewide extreme heat resilience action plan is meant to be implemented. This slide provides a synthesis of the kinds of real-world outcomes that we are striving towards. The actions in this plan will build New Jersey's resilience to climate impacts in a variety of ways, while ensuring that resources flow to the people who need it the most. So, with no further ado, let's move into some brainstorming together. This is our first time trying this approach, so open to feedback, but let's go ahead and dive in. So we're going to spend, and I'm looking at the time here, I think we can spend, let's see, is that 35 minutes? Yeah, we can spend 10 minutes on each slide. And so what I'm going to do is set a timer on my side as we go through each of these slides to ask for your feedback. And what we're looking for you to do is share with us. We want to collect your ideas so that we can share back with you what everyone is telling us they would like state agencies to advance. So it's particularly helpful for us to focus your brainstorming around possible resilience actions focused on each of the categories: people, infrastructure, systems, and ecosystems, so that as we're collecting ideas in the chat, they're related to the slide for our own team's back-end organizing. So just a second, someone on my team is going to drop this question into the chat. What ideas should or could state agencies take to protect people that are at risk from extreme heat impacts? And for the benefit of the recording, I'm gonna sort of narrate some of the things that are coming in the chat, and I'm starting my timer now. So on the screen, you see different kinds of impacted stakeholder groups. That is a sort of synthesis of some of the desktop research that we've done. When you think about these impacted populations, what kinds of interventions could state agencies take to address some of these impacts that people are facing? So one question is engaging the people who are affected. Thank you for that, Sharon. So doing a really specific sort of outreach strategy to talk to people about what needs they have. Unfortunately, someone's saying that their meeting chat is muted. I'm not sure why that would be the case, David. If you want to try logging out and logging back in, that might solve for the problem, but that's actually not something I know how to solve for. There's a comment about designating cooling shelters to have backup power because the area where this person lives loses power frequently. Multilingual notification systems that are targeted through multiple forms of communications channels. Renewable microgrids. David, I saw that you left and came back in. Are you able to access the chat now? This may be if someone's logging in to join but doesn't have a Teams account, that might be an issue. So I'm especially glad that we created a process so that you can unmute yourself. So in a minute, we'll let you unmute yourself and share. And in the meantime, I'll keep narrating ideas that are coming in. Green infrastructure, green roofs, plantscapes, etc. Distributed energy microgrids, business districts. So microgrids in business districts, in school campuses, etc. Thank you, Deb. I'm recognizing that a few folks aren't able to reach the chat, so I'm glad we have two methods for people to communicate ideas. So one comment is about where possible moving construction or outdoor work into the cooler hours of the day. So instead of having outdoor laborers work during the peak of summer, to have that happen in the dusk hours, as long as noise isn't an issue. Also to increase the use of microforests and street trees. Oh yay, David, I'm so glad that solved itself. I don't know what you did. Reaching out to groups with possible health risks so that they know what they should be on the lookout for. So really targeted communications, we've heard that a couple times now, particularly related to increased air pollution during periods of higher temperatures. So for example, folks that are asthmatic, doing a specific intervention for asthmatic folks. Someone's saying, I know heat pumps use less energy for cooling. Do they also create less heat to the outdoors? If so, funding for heat pump installation. Really great points. Multi-purpose hubs. Some people will call those resilience hubs to feed people, to keep them cool, to keep them dry from flooding, to create a shelter, a multi-use shelter. Targeted risk communications that leverage the trusted voices, trusted messengers, community-based institutions, and are tailored at individuals that are part of some of these high-risk, high-sensitive installations. Planting trees, exclamation point. Expanding weatherization, retrofitting, and energy assistance programs. Emphasis on tree species that don't disrupt underground infrastructure, okay? And working with health departments so that municipalities and counties are coordinated. We're doing great on time. We got 5 more minutes, so let's do maybe a minute or 2 more of chat, and then we will enable unmuting everyone so that folks who would like to use the raised hand feature will stack the comments to make sure everybody gets a chance. So an emphasis, oh, I think I read this one already. Sorry if I emphasis on tree species that don't disrupt underground infrastructure. That came through twice. Britt Paul came through twice, FYI. And for anyone who's having trouble reading the screen, I can actually just articulate aloud some of these impacted stakeholder groups. Children are more susceptible to dehydration and they play outside more than adults do. Outdoor day laborers, people without air conditioning, low-income families, or anyone who may have trouble affording energy bills. So they might have an air conditioner, but they don't turn it on. Outdoor workers, farm workers, US military that train and work outside, field-based researchers, populations that rely on public transit. They might bike in the heat or they have to wait outside for a bus or a train. Elderly, aging population, homeless population, folks that live in older homes or apartments with poor ventilation, road maintenance crews, athletes, including young athletes, people with pre-existing health conditions, construction workers. I may have said some of these already. Pregnant people have a high core body temperature and are more susceptible to heat-related illness. Roofers, people with disabilities, including individuals with mental health issues, those who depend on others for assistance in their daily living, and those with limited mobility or limited access to transportation. Okay, more thoughts coming in. Let me rattle some of these off real quick before we open up the chat. So one idea is to create incentives for the use of alternative asphalt materials so that municipalities have an incentive program there. More public water fountains. I'm pretty sure that's a strategy they use in Italy. Seems like they disappeared with phone booths. Okay, water stations all over, exclamation point. Renewable energy powered shade areas. Okay, there's like a lot there, including bus stations. So they did double as energy access. So they're a charging station and shade. Ashley, would you kindly enable participants to be able to unmute themselves on the back end? So what we'll do now is we'll use the last sort of 3 minutes of this 10-minute chunk before we move on for anyone who's not able to access the chat. So what you'll have to do is please raise your hand, use the raised hand feature, which is part of your Zoom window. So I think we might need to navigate back to that slide so people know where it is in their menu bar if needed. And if you raise your hand, we'll call on you, and that way we don't have people talking over each other. Is everyone's chat issues resolved? Because I know some folks weren't able to see the chat earlier. Do y'all want to move on to the next topic? And then, or I'm surprised. I know we have such smart people in New Jersey. Thoughts about vulnerable populations and how state agencies could or should take actions? Yes, smart people. We've got some of our interagency council members in the chat, really encouraging people to speak up. Actually didn't see any ideas. This is a colleague from our Department of Agriculture. I didn't see any ideas focused on farm workers or the agriculture sector. Ashley, can I ask you to jump back to the slide that is about vulnerable populations? Solar powered shaded areas so that we're generating power and providing cooling in all commercial parking lots. And then, yes, obviously all of our council agencies are advancing this work, and part of the effort of the Resilience Action Plan is capturing work that's underway as well as our aspirational ideas. Thank you. Marie, I know you're really trying to be able to access the chat, so I'm hoping that works for you. And if not, I've got about a minute on my timer before we move on to the next. We can just move on a little early. Okay, we're going to definitely leave 10 minutes at the end of the meeting to make sure that if more ideas are coming up, folks can contribute those to any of the ideas. Sorry, Marie. Okay, let's move on to the next slide. So we're going to spend another 10 minutes or so on the topic of built environment action ideas. As before, please use a few minutes to sort of brainstorm and drop ideas into the chat. And you'll see that the question, the focus question, is in the chat for us here. What actions should or could state agencies take to protect infrastructure systems at risk from extreme heat impacts? So some of the infrastructure systems, the electrical grid. What would it mean if we had rolling blackouts in the middle of a heat wave? Aging transportation systems, drinking water systems that may experience the challenges of harmful algal blooms, wastewater treatment systems that may depend on a certain sort of temperature variation, telecommunication systems and internet service provision infrastructure, our ports, our airports, schools. A lot of our schools don't have air conditioning. This can be especially an issue in hotter areas, urban areas, military infrastructure, bases with very high impervious area. Now, train lines, the actual rail tracks could bend slightly or kink due to extreme heat, which could cause derailment. Business sector disruption, structural damage to bridge joints and pavement, such as buckling or rutting. Cities and urban areas, warehousing or distribution centers with high impervious areas. So again, this trend towards talking about areas with a lot of asphalt, blacktop, etc. Failing cooling system in all kinds of buildings. Dialysis centers, naming that kidney, like asthma was named earlier in the chat, folks with any kind of kidney disease, heart disease, chronic pulmonary disease, you know, are particularly vulnerable to extreme heat exposure, and therefore the built infrastructure that serves those populations are possibly vulnerable as well. Thermoelectric power plants may have to cut capacity if river water they use for cooling gets warmer. Hospitals and emergency rooms, particularly during heat wave events, mobile home parks. What should we do to protect highly exposed and sensitive assets? Okay, so ideas are coming in the chat here. Green roofs, again, especially for warehouse developments. Investing in community-based climate resiliency projects for port-adjacent communities, so Newark and Elizabeth. Upgrading electrical grid to handle a greater input from residential solar power and to provide more power that can offset potential brownouts. I didn't start my timer. I did look at the clock though. So I'm just gonna do a few more minutes on that one. timer. Other ideas, what kinds of things could state agencies do to protect highly exposed and sensitive assets? Getting accurate heat island data and requiring new development to incorporate measures into their design, such as presumably offering funding for existing buildings. So new development, interventions for new development, and interventions like funding for existing buildings, retrofitting. Consider that instead of focusing on commuter resiliency, for example, NJ Transit, focus on repurposing some of transit for emergency supply distribution. We have a better chance of trying to bring up strategic parts of the grid if it goes down versus trying to resurrect the whole grid. So for example, the New Jersey Transit Kearney Power Plant, to resurrect entire grid failure is flawed. Emergency management teams statewide need to be coordinated. Okay, there's a lot there, Deb, and when we get to that moment, maybe you can unmute yourself if you'd like. Are there rail/track materials that are more heat resistant than the current material used? They may have raised streets in my area. We must deal with climate change itself, not ways around it. Elevate critical equipment for speedy recovery after flooding, but think like the Dutch and design with water in mind. Okay, a couple comments that I think are about flood resilience, but thrown in the mix here. Ideas about actions specific to infrastructure systems, built environment systems. Adequate backup generators for hospitals and emergency rooms. Now let me invite people to use the raised hand feature if you'd like to unmute yourself. A variety of much stronger sustainable design requirements for major warehousing developments appearing along major distribution routes. White roofs, green roofs, solar power, vegetation, green infrastructure. I'm worried about the design of these new mega developments that will worsen heat and stormwater for decades. Okay, Deb, go ahead. You should be able to unmute yourself now.
Good?
Yes, I hear you.
Thank you. So yes, I agree with the last comment. I guess it was Sarah, but one of the questions I had at the start, just so that I could assemble my thinking here, the resiliency planning that Jersey City, Newark, Bayonne, and Hoboken went through for a couple of years there focused a lot on flooding. And you guys are coming out, and that was funded, and I understood that, you know, call it Resilient New Jersey, that was going on all over the state, quadrant the state. and that was mostly focused on flooding, yet you're coming out with your first resiliency action plan focused on extreme heat. And to Sarah's point a moment ago, these are related when you start talking through the lens of the built environment. So how would that entire body of work, which I thought was exceptional, you know, I guess the state had Arcadis facilitating that in the Northeast for us. They did an extraordinary job. And a lot of these same questions were, you know, distilled. So how are you using that body of work for this, even though the topic seems to be more about flooding than, but we did speak about vulnerable populations, we're talking about the environment. Right.
No, absolutely. And not every, I think we had a total of 21 municipalities that went through an exercise like the cities that you named, right? So there were 4 regional resilience initiatives under the banner of Resilient NJ that went on at that scale. This is a statewide plan, so not everyone would have even known about the plan that you're familiar with, but certainly our exercise of gleaning includes other parts of the state as well as inside of the state. So hopefully that answers your question. We've got a bunch of parallel exercises that are happening, conversations internal to the Interagency Council, each of the departments that are part of the Interagency Council, executive branch agencies, as well as collectively among the 22 executive branch agencies that are part of the council, as well as with advisory groups and individual sessions with stakeholder types, including municipal officials. You know, so there's a lot of levels to this. And because this is really early on in the process of our public engagement, these questions are attempting to glean information from more folks.
Natalie, I'm gonna add to that. So
Thank you.
Deb's, as you know, the Resilient NJ, the regional plans, and some other municipal plans where we're working are largely, not wholly, but largely focused on kind of what municipalities can do or should do, and can and should do as a region. There are, of course, in those plans, actions that the state should take, and so where those actions are applicable to this topic of extreme heat, we will be looking at the plans that we've developed through that process, that have been developed otherwise, that have been developed by other state agencies, and then again nationally, to kind of pull together those ideas that might work. And then again, I think as I noted earlier on, while we're focusing on extreme heat in this statewide resilience action plan, we are looking in the survey, which the link is in the chat, for your input on what are the other topic areas, impact areas from climate change that we should be building resilience action plans on after this one.
So is that, you know, sorry, just a quick understanding of that, Nick. The resiliency action plan rollout one after another, is it one a year? So this year it's focused on extreme heat, next year it'll be something else, or more frequently?
We're hoping that they're going to be more frequent, although, you know, as this is our first one, we are kind of testing the waters. We're piloting this process, but it is our hope that we'll be able to move these faster than once a year. I think, you know, we didn't touch on it in this webinar, we did in the first one, but our schedule here is generally to release a final plan 2 years after the full statewide strategy was released, which is in October. So it's not quite a year to build one of these, we don't think. But again, we'll see whether there's improvements and efficiencies that we identify through this initial process.
Great, thank you very much.
Right, let's move to our third bucket of action types, which is actions around our natural systems and our ecosystems. I do see one last comment on the previous one, so thank you, Sarah, for sneaking that in before we drop in the third question in the chat. Roads and runways could utilize more low carbon concrete. So the question of focus that you'll see in the chat in just a minute is what should we do to protect highly exposed and sensitive ecosystems? So examples of these freshwater systems are groundwater recharge rates, forests, woods, and wetlands, urban canopy, orchards, crop productivity, habitat loss, habitats, and the fact that we may have habitat loss, may/will, agricultural land and working lands, streams, rivers, and aquatic species, migratory birds, nesting, feeding grounds, oceans, estuaries, parks, natural areas, reserves. What could or should we do to protect highly exposed and sensitive ecosystems? I am starting my timer this time. Stronger protections for farmlands / incentives to not sell farmland and instead encourage transit-oriented to dense development. So 2 ideas in one there. Other thoughts? This is by no means your only opportunity to offer comment. As Nick said, we have a feedback form, a virtual feedback form. I know a lot of people hate surveys, so we wanted to create as many sort of opportunities. We also have an email address where we invite you to send us thoughts. We'll send that at the end of the meeting, but just naming that if folks feel like they can't come up with everything, we will certainly create other chances to engage in the process. Okay, some more thoughts coming in. Impermeable surface allowances need to be greatly reduced and enforced properly to allow better groundwater recharge and allow for the maintaining of vegetation to reduce heat impacts. Regenerative farming, living shorelines, use of dredge materials to raise marshes, build more green infrastructure, wetlands, expand what we already have. Footprints will be damaged, so build them up now, so more remains in the end. Encourage native plantings for trees and variety of plantings to prevent mass die-offs from disease. Financial incentive for conservation practices. Prevent clear cutting and large developments to maintain older growth trees that provide shade. As folks have noted before, there's a lot of crossover in some of these comments, and that's certainly expected. We had to have some way of providing a framework for how to facilitate the conversation, but certainly a lot of cross-cutting ideas. Would you like another minute or so for comments in the chat? Update state DOT guidelines or other guidelines for streetscape to include better incorporation of vegetation, parentheses, trees often sacrificed for even minor road projects. and prevent clear cutting of residential properties. The previous example was large development, residential properties in the name of maximizing residential solar power outputs. Provide funding, all caps, for more green infrastructure, including urban forestry. And thankfully, there is funding coming down the pike from the feds for just this. We're hoping to capture as much of it to New Jersey. Revisit affordable housing distributions for my municipalities in sensitive areas. All right, I want to create some space for anyone who would like to unmute. As before, please use the raised hand feature so that we can sort of call on you. Make sure that not more than one person talking at once. You're being shy tonight. All right, let's more funding for Green Acres. More funding for Green Acres, explore avenues for crop markets. So I'm going to move us into the last section here, where we basically want to open up the floor to open discussion. Obviously, you can write questions in the chat, or we're welcoming anyone who would like to use the raise hand feature to do so that you can provide verbal comment. And then I would like to ask one of our team members to please drop the online feedback form link into the chat. So we do think of tonight's exercise as separate and apart from the responses to the feedback form, recognizing that the feedback form offers a little bit more sort of specifics than this exercise, where it's sort of just, this one was, I would say, broader and allows all sorts of different ideas to come forward, whereas you're kind of sort of led through a series of questions in the feedback form. So I invite everyone to please take the feedback form. We'd appreciate your input. Please share it with colleagues, any audiences that you collaborate with, so that we can make sure that we're really representing the needs and wants of New Jerseyans. And I believe on the next slide, we have sort of an image of the feedback form. So when you click the button in the chat, the link that was shared in the chat, which has the recording of our webinars, it's got our slides, it's got the scoping document that describes the resilience action plans as statewide interagency council products. And it's also got this link to this feedback form. So please do take that. It's got an opportunity for you to sign up for our distribution list. And if you would rather not sign up for the distribution list, then we've created the attendance sort of form today so that you could provide us your email address if you did not log into. We didn't create a registration form for Teams in order to make it as possible for as many people to participate. But if you would like us to email with you, then go ahead and let us know through that attendee survey. It is possible to send direct emails to us, absolutely. So let me just grab it from the website so I make sure I'm not having typos. But when you are on the website webpage for the resilience action plans, at the very bottom, you see a direct email inbox that is actually shared by our team. So multiple of us have easy access to it. There's also a telephone number, again, a shared telephone number so that we can make sure to respond to everybody in a timely manner. I'm dropping that in the chat now. And you can find it on our webpage for the resilience action plans. And there's a comment here saying that the new, I know the new state water supply plan will have a climate change component. Are you working with them? And it's a great question. So there are 22 executive branch agencies that are members of the Interagency Council. Each one of those agencies are having concerted internal conversations with all of their various programs and divisions, and subunits, etc., about contributions into the Extreme Heat Resilience Action Plan. DEP is no exception. So we have had a series of meetings with all of our internal colleagues, including our water resource management team, about making sure that we're aligned in not only the work that we're doing, but that we're gathering ideas that help advance the work of the water supply plan and the work of this plan. Thanks for the question. I think because no one's really chomping at the bit here, I'm going to ask Nick to come back on and see if you have any closing remarks that you'd like to share with everyone.
Nothing specific. I will thank everybody for coming out this evening or participating this evening. We do, as Natalie mentioned, there are multiple opportunities to provide us feedback regarding what you'd like to see in this resilience action plan around extreme heat specifically, as well as in the survey around kind of what you think we should be doing around resilience action plans in the future. We also expect that we will, as we work with our other state agencies to develop a draft that will certainly be released. The schedule again is to have that out this summer when it's still hot and front of mind for all of you. And there will be a public review and public comment process. And I expect that we will similarly have public webinars to allow some feedback. And as I noted earlier, it is our intent to have this the final version of this plan out this fall, and then quickly take a breath and then maybe quickly move into the next development of the next resilience action plan, along with cooperation and in coordination with our state agency partners. I see there's a couple more comments, largely saying thank you. And again, thank you all for coming out this evening. Natalie, any last words?
I think we'll wrap now. We'll probably wrap the recording sort of here when we're clipping it to put it on the website and everything. But I think that for anyone who missed the first webinar and would like to understand a little bit more about, this process, or would like to offer, I know in the first webinar, people had really specific ideas about how to partner with faith institutions, with health practitioners, with, municipalities to bring this conversation to more people. Very, very open to any suggestions or ideas that people have on that. And I do see a raised hand. Christine, you should be able to unmute yourself. Hello.
Nope, it was an error. Sorry. Nick is going to yell at me. Sorry.
She inadvertently raised her hand last webinar too.
I was trying to give you a thumbs up.
Thank you so much, everyone. Obviously, it has been a very warm winter, and we just had our first snow where I live on Tuesday, and we recognize that maybe it's hard to think about these ideas when it's not, excessively hot or we're in the middle of a heat wave, but we're still having a very warm winter too. So it's both those excessive heat events and this sort of slow creeping changes in our ecosystem that are our focus, and we invite all of those ideas. Please take the survey, and thank you so much for joining us tonight.
All right, everyone.